Why did my dad choose his new wife over calling 911 for me? I was helping Dad's new wife Margot set up for her book club meeting when the ladder I was standing on suddenly shifted under my feet. One second I was hanging fairy lights across the living room ceiling, and the next I was falling backwards through the air with my arms flailing trying to grab onto something. I hit the hardwood floor so hard that the sound echoed through the whole house, and for a moment I couldn't breathe or move or do anything except lie there staring up at the ceiling fan spinning above me. Pain exploded up my spine and radiated through my whole body in waves that made my vision blur and darken at the edges. Margot rushed over and knelt beside me asking if I was okay, but when I tried to answer, nothing came out except a weird gasping sound. I attempted to sit up and immediately felt something wrong in my back, a grinding sensation that made me cry out and collapse back onto the floor. My legs felt strange and tingly like they'd fallen asleep, and when I tried to move my right leg, it wouldn't respond the way it should. Margot told me to stay still and pulled out her phone, and I thought she was calling 911, but instead she was texting someone. Dad came running in from the garage where he'd been working on his car, and his face went white when he saw me lying on the floor. I tried to tell him I couldn't feel my legs properly, but the words came out slurred and wrong. He knelt down next to me and asked what happened, and Margot explained about the ladder slipping. Dad started to reach for his phone, and Margot grabbed his wrist, saying we should wait a minute to see if I was really hurt or just shaken up. I stared at her in disbelief because I was lying on the floor unable to move my legs, and she wanted to wait and see if I was really hurt. Dad hesitated with his phone in his hand and looked between me and Margot with this conflicted expression I'd never seen before. Margot kept talking in this calm, soothing voice about how ambulances were expensive, and my stepmom had always been dramatic about injuries, and maybe I just needed a few minutes to catch my breath. She said her nephew had fallen off a ladder last year and seemed really hurt at first, but was fine after lying down for a while. The tingling in my legs was getting worse and spreading up into my hips, and I could feel panic rising in my chest, making it even harder to breathe. I managed to gasp out that something was really wrong with my back, and I needed help now. Dad finally started dialing 911, but Margot put her hand over his phone and said we should at least try to get me to the couch first to see if I could walk. She said if I could move on my own, then we'd know it wasn't serious enough for an ambulance. Dad actually agreed with her, and they both tried to help me sit up, and the pain that shot through my spine made me scream so loud that our neighbor's dog started barking. I collapsed back onto the floor sobbing and begging them to call for help, but Margot was still talking about how we should give it a few more minutes. She kept saying that her book club was starting in less than an hour, and having paramedics here would completely ruin the evening she'd been planning for weeks. Dad was looking at his phone, and then at Margot, and then at me, and I could see him actually weighing his options, like this was a difficult decision instead of an obvious emergency. The fact that he wasn't immediately calling 911 while I lay there unable to move my legs properly made something crack inside my chest that had nothing to do with the fall. Margot suggested they could drive me to the urgent care clinic instead of calling an ambulance, saying it would be faster and cheaper and wouldn't disrupt her book club. She was already pulling up the address on her phone while I lay there on the floor trying to explain that I couldn't move and something was seriously wrong with my spine. Dad said maybe that was a good idea and started talking about how to get me into the car, completely ignoring the fact that moving someone with a potential spinal injury without proper equipment could cause permanent damage. I'd learned that in health class just last semester, but apparently neither of them remembered or cared about that basic safety information. My vision was getting fuzzy around the edges, and the tingling sensation had spread all the way up to my chest now, and I was terrified that whatever was wrong was getting worse while they stood there debating logistics. Margot checked her watch and said if they were going to drive me to urgent care, they needed to leave right now so she could be back before her guests arrived. The casual way she said it, like my potential paralysis was just an inconvenient scheduling conflict, made me realize that Dad had married someone who genuinely didn't care if I lived or died. I tried one more time to tell them I needed an ambulance and that you're not supposed to move someone with a back injury, but Dad was already agreeing with Margot's plan. He went to pull the car into the garage while Margot stood over me explaining that the urgent care clinic was only 15 minutes away, and they had x-ray machines and everything an emergency room would have. I was crying and trying to make them understand that I physically could not move my legs normally, and that this was exactly the kind of situation where you call 911 no matter what, but Margot just kept checking her phone and muttering about her book club and how much work she'd put into planning this evening. Dad came back and they discussed how to lift me, and I was screaming at them not to move me, that they were going to make it worse, but they weren't listening, and what happened next changed everything. The rest of the story is linked below or on my channel.